Hello, everyone. I just wanted to share some thoughts on a discussion that I had in the live chat of last week's Week in Review, which is a weekly live stream hosted on Jen, aka Church of Entropy's channel, that she does with Duvid. That's Duvid with 4 O's, I think. And of course, these streams tend to go very, very long. They were talking about all kinds of different things, and at one point there was a big debate between Claire and another guy. I forgot his name. I'm really sorry. Oh, it started with an N? Norman? I'm sorry. That's very rude of me to forget. But anyway, there was a point where the conversation, at least the one in the live chat, was directed toward usury, or someone had mentioned it. And this is something that I've never quite been totally clear on, so I decided to kind of pick a few brains and figure out what people really mean by it. Because as far as I can tell, usury typically means insurance, but too much. And I wanted to kind of get a feel for where people drew that line. I'm sorry, not insurance, interest, but too much. And I wanted to figure out, like, how much interest is too much interest. And Claire clarified that basically if you have compound interest, then that's too much. You can have like a strict flat rate for interest, and that's about it. Whereas other people in the chat said all interest is usury. Literally all interest is usury by some people's standard. And this of course strikes me as completely ridiculous, right? Well, first of all, if it's the same thing, then why even have a different term, right? So they mean that they want to get rid of all interest. Some of them. Now, personally, I think that this is just a really bitch-made kind of a complaint. You know, if you are an adult and you enter into contracts, you agreed to that. Like, I don't really see a person who has to pay a lot in interest as being a victim. And at the same time, when you say, well, certain deals are totally exploitative and shouldn't be on the table, I'm not sure if that's ever completely the case, because if you need a really big and short-term loan, obviously, for somebody to front you that amount of real usable money in that moment, there's value associated with that. So of course that's going to come with a higher interest rate, and it's the market that's going to determine where that rate falls. And in some markets, that sort of money for a loan, particularly in like a high trust society, that might be a lower rate, whereas a society that doesn't have as much trust and where you don't have any credit or any history of showing that you can pay it back, you're going to have a higher rate. And I think that's very logical and makes a lot of sense. And the real problem is a lack of competition. The more competition you have in lending money, the better the rates are for people. And of course, in a situation where you're one of the only people with the money to loan to people, well, why shouldn't you loan it to the person who's willing to pay the highest interest? Clearly, they're the person with the most confidence in their ability to pay it back promptly. So a lot of things are packaged into the use of interest that make a lot of sense. And if you understand that, time is money, to me it's just so plainly, nakedly obvious that all of this like condemnation of usury is completely stupid and makes no sense. And this I think carries over to Claire's condemnation of like specific kinds of interest. I think that's ludicrous. I think it's completely ridiculous. Like, of course, if that's part of the deal, we should have more choices, not fewer choices, in how we set that up. So this is kind of like the basic bitch alt quote unquote right? I mean, in this sense, they're highly leftist in their manipulation and control of the economy. So I would not consider them right wing, but these are people who may be considered part of the alt right. And then kind of the leftist progressive reciprocal to this is hatred of insurance. I saw like a recent acquaintance who had posted, they're a Bernie supporter, and they posted how, like health insurance is the problem, which is like also completely ridiculous. If you go uninsured, you are taking a risk, and that risk has a reward associated with it in the form of like you're not paying for an insurance service. The person who pays for the insurance service gets a payout in the event that the conditions for that insurance are met. So to give everybody the advantage of being insured, regardless of whether or not they're paying for that insurance, completely defeats the purpose. And there are all kinds of situations where maybe it makes sense to go uninsured. Like if you're going to be avoiding the kinds of activities that result in you needing that insurance, obviously, it's not very valuable to you. But, for example, if you're somebody who is a fire spinner, right? You do shows where you're lighting things on fire and twirling them around and throwing them and fire breathing and doing all this crap, and you're doing it indoors and shit, right? Obviously you should probably think about getting some kind of insurance that is sensitive to that kind of activity. Whereas if you're someone who doesn't really do anything related to that, then what value would that possibly have? And this carries over to health. It's people who make poor health decisions that should probably consider getting very robust health insurance. Whereas if you're somebody who's very young, very healthy, and has a good regimen of dieting and exercising, obviously there's exceptions. There are kind of freak accidents and crazy things that happen. But, this is the exception to the rule, and a lot of narratives pretend this isn't the case because they want to, as much as possible, minimize personal responsibility in needing these kinds of healthcare. So, for a person who's very healthy, you would probably prefer to just either go uninsured or to have insurance that only strictly deals with just really, really catastrophic and unforeseeable, freak accidents. And of course, your insurance, being that it covers less, will be cheaper. And this was one thing that really bothered me when I think it was a lot of people's insurance, they were taken off of their plan because basically the government decided that these plans were a bad deal. And I remember I was working at a law firm at this time, and a lot of the lawyers were sympathetic to this. They said, oh yeah, these people should not be on these plans. These plans are horrible. They don't cover anything. It's a bad rate. And I sat there just kind of thinking wow, fuck you people. How dare you? How dare you go into somebody else's private contract and feel like the government has any place to tell them that, no, your values are wrong. You're not allowed to value this thing. And I think, God, that's just one thing that just sticks with me. And I really feel like a lot of that perspective was particular to lawyers, people in law who just think that they're fucking better than everyone else because they can color in the lines and then carve out a niche and then are completely complicit with living off of a system that they know is just heinously both unethical and immoral. So anyway, on the right, the bitch-made left-wing right, you have this hatred and condemnation of usury, or just interest in general. And then on the left, you have this super bitch-made hatred of insurance in general. And there's a common line here. I really think that these things are parallel. They make a lot of sense in relation to each other. It's the point where both of these people decide that they're not adults anymore and that they want the government to step in and to make their own decisions for them. And this is one thing that I wanted to point out because, my perspective in, allowing both of these things and in saying the government should get out of it is a very libertarian one. And this is an example where libertarians are actually asserting adult responsibility on behalf of free people. And of course, a lot of these free people are fighting this standard, kicking and screaming, because essentially they're children. And when I say that, that's kind of an insult to children. It's really unfair, right? Like children are children, it's fair for them to act the way that they are. It's not easy being a child. And I mean that. But of course, when grown adults, well past the age of adulthood, well past 18, 20, once you're 30 as a millennial, that's adult, right? Like uncontrovertibly. So, and it's these people who are 30 and over, who are crying about these things, and it's very, very childish. Now, part of the conversation that was very interesting, though, was Korea Man. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name because it's in Chinese and I can't read, but he's Korean and uses the Chinese name, and he's a big fan of dynastic China and in authoritarian communist China and in strong arm rule and all that kind of stuff, right? So he gives me crap for being libertarian all the time, and it's fun, it's whatever. But he linked me to an article, and unfortunately I can't find it right now because I'm on a different computer than the one I was on when he sent me the link. But it had to do with jubilees in dynastic China. And the idea of the jubilee was that the government would just declare that nobody has any debt anymore. They would just push a button and say, nope, nobody has any debt. You know, if you're loaned money to someone, fuck you. You're not going to get that money. And this is very popular. A lot of people really like this. And I think this is because people tend to dehumanize the class of people who give loans. They tend to dehumanize bankers and merchants. And I was criticized in the live chat of this stream that Jen was hosting. I was criticized by Gandalf as well as Korean Man as being very mercantilist in a sense, or very like merchant-centric. And I think I have kind of a general idea of what they mean, but obviously, this was just kind of a small back and forth in the live chat that was kind of unrelated to what even the stream had been talking about at the moment. But I really think that characterization, the reason it's unfair is because it's not me that's like going out of my way to be pro-banker or pro-merchant. It's the fact that I believe both of them are operating within a paradigm that's already dehumanized these people. And they'll point to these things and say, oh, authoritarian regimes invented the pyramids. Authoritarian regimes did this, did that. But of course, they don't factor in opportunity cost. And what I mean by that is they're erasing all of the victims. They're erasing what could be if not for taxation. They're erasing what could be if not for government regulation. And there's really no way to know definitively what would exist in the absence of it. Of course, people would argue that all of the order that resulted from statism created the environment that was necessary for any wealth to exist. And I think that's bullshit. I think that's complete bullshit. I think that anytime you deregulate a service, it always ends up better, just like without exception. And that once we realize this as a species, we're going to realize that, wow, like we've paid a massive cost for having authoritarian, statist, centralized dispute resolution and arbitration and law. So, I don't know, remains to be seen. We'll see what happens. But the point is that, there's a cost to building the pyramids that obviously isn't being factored in terms of, like slavery. And there's a cost to these jubilees, which is that it essentially creates a low trust society. It lowers the value of loans. It makes it so that when you give someone a loan, you're going to have to charge them more because now there's this unknown chance that the government will just arbitrarily decide that loans don't matter. And the issue with jubilees is that you can't just like have jubilees on a schedule, right? You can't just say, okay, every 5 years on this date, we're gonna cancel all debts and wipe the slate clean, right? Because if it's predictable, then you can just factor that into all of your agreements and just work around it. So it needs to have an element of unpredictability, right? And the article that was linked to me by Mr. Korean Man was they have a baby and the baby's cute, so they declare a jubilee. A new dynasty takes over, so there's a jubilee. Whatever. Like there's just all kinds of just arbitrary things, right? And that's the only way that you could make a system like this work, is to have your jubilee happen and to be totally unpredictable. That's one way to offset the negative externality of having this. Now, it made me think about this concept though. Like, is there a circumstance where I would support a jubilee? And there is one. I would say that the United States government should let the United States dollar collapse and to get rid of the Federal Reserve and to get rid of all laws that prohibit the use of competing currencies and to essentially just like print like a $10 trillion bill and hand it to China and say, here you go, right? And this way, this would solve the U.S. debt crisis, right, in a way. It would erase all of the debt that the United States government owes. It would undo the savaging of the unborn, perpetrated primarily by the boomers, but I don't believe the Gen Xers are off the hook either. Gen Xers are kind of just boomer light, to be honest. Like virtually half of millennials are basically boomers. But yeah, you'd get rid of the debt that way, right? Another solution I thought of is what the United States should do is they should annex some land, right? They should annex like some chunk of Antarctica, or annex like New Zealand, because fuck them. Or you know what? Just annex Europe, right? Annex Europe because we're more diverse, so they'll welcome us. But obviously, I think that we win in that sense. And what's the EU gonna do about it? They don't have an army yet, or whatever. Or like annex like a part of Russia secretly, and like Putin won't notice. And then what you do is you have all 50 states secede from the Union afterwards. And then this way, you know, the entire national government is just bound to whatever land was annexed. And it literally doesn't matter what land gets annexed. You could even annex like part of China and then have China just invade and take back what it's owed, right? And then China would just overthrow the US government. But all 50 states will have seceded by them anyway, so it wouldn't even be relevant, you know, like something like that, right? And then, yeah, and then that would be one way to solve the US debt crisis. And honestly, I think that's a very reasonable solution. And this would be a form of Jubilee. Or you could just declare a Jubilee, right? And just get rid of the US dollar as a currency and then just, you know, let the fallout happen. But, you know, crypto will figure out, you know, how to solve it, basically. So anyway, those are just some thoughts I had on that. And I wanted to record a video about it before I forgot about that because I think some of that stuff is very interesting. So if you have any interesting thoughts on this, let me know in the comment section, and I hope you have a nice day.